Dan Mozersky enjoyed a long and fruitful career in the retail book industry. As a founding member of Indigo Books and Music's executive team, he was instrumental in turning the company's vision into reality. During the 1990s, he served as a manager of U.S. operations for Classic Books in New York. Prior to this, he founded and owned a chain of retail bookstores in Ottawa and Montreal. Active in the Canadian Booksellers Association, he served as director, vice president, and chair of various industry committees. In 1985, he was recognized by the Canadian Book Publishers Professional Association as Bookseller of the Year. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you for having me.
You studied English at Carleton University.
Correct.
Did that have anything to do with the career you decided to get into?
Probably, yeah. I did a BA, sort of a bit of a checkered academic career, but I finally kind of settled down and got serious about university. I moved from Winnipeg to Montreal in 1966. My girlfriend at that time, who was then married and is still my wife, followed. And my first job outside of sort of things I'd done in Winnipeg or as a teenager was I worked at Classic Bookshop in Montreal. I got a letter of introduction to Louis Melzack and actually to Rose Melzack. So Louis kind of ran the front end of the business and the buying, and Rose, his wife, ran the kind of back end, the operational part of the business. I believe it was Rose who hired me because my letter of introduction was to her from a relative of hers in Winnipeg. So my first job outside as an adult was working at Classic Bookshop in Montreal in the summer of 1966. They had a number of stores, and you know, talking about Louis Melzack, Classic Books was the place, the bookstore in Canada in the 60s. He was opening a large number of stores. Most at that time were in Montreal, but then he started to open in Toronto. While I was there, he opened a store on the East Coast, I believe in Halifax, and then was rolling out these stores. And Louis was an old style bookman, devoted to literature, serious book selling, and one learned a lot by working at Classic Bookshop. And in Montreal, he had a number of stores. He had a paperback store on St. Catherine Street. He had a children's bookstore on St. Catherine Street. He had sort of his main store also on St. Catherine Street. And then he opened up two stores in Place Ville Marie, one of which I believe was designed by Mies van der Rohe. You know, and I think Mies van der Rohe also designed his main store on St. Catherine Street.
You mean the inside of the bookstore?
Yeah, was laid out. Fixtures were designed and laid out. So they had two stores at Place Ville Marie, a small one in the concourse below, and a large one on the main level, and somewhat in anticipation of Expo 67. So there was a lot of, you know, building excitement, and people were anticipating this world event. And part of that was designing this world-class store, and indeed it was a world-class store.
Were they friends, or was this before he hit the big time? Because that'd be pretty expensive to...
No, Mies van der Rohe was in the mid-60s, still had hit the big time. You know, he was a world-class major architect. It would be like having Frank Gehry today, you know, commissioning him to design a bookstore. I don't believe they were friends. I believe this was you know, he commissioned him to do the design.
So he would have put out quite a bit of money for that.
I would imagine. Yeah, I would imagine.
Wow. Okay. What made the layout of that bookstore world class?
The quality of the fixtures, for one. Sort of, memory serves me, solid wood fixtures, wall units. There was windows on two walls and then two inner walls. So the units were on the inner, there were wall units on the inner walls, and behind them was a door, and there was storage all behind the door, behind these wall units. I would just say the quality of the fixtures and the quality of the layout. It was, and then what one of the things that Louis did was of course, besides this very high quality selection of books and titles, he also sold replica sculptures. So on the top of the units, like the inner units, was a kind of a shelf, and all throughout the store would be displayed replicas of Greek and Roman heads, for example, that you could buy, right? That people could come in and buy. He sold posters, art posters.
It sounds like a beautiful store, but we still haven't got to why it's a world-class bookstore.
It was a world-class bookstore in that it was, in terms of design, quality of fixtures, quality of the inventory, a store that could compete with basically any good bookstore in any major city across the world.
Okay, so what made the stock so good?
Well, it was not just bestsellers, so lots of serious backlist. So those were the days when publishers were developing what were called trade paperback lines, and were republishing literature, serious literature, in sturdier paperback formats other than the mass market, right?
Yeah.
So a number of publishers developed these. Random House, Doubleday had Anchor. The reputation was that they were sewn and not glued, and they were on quality paper. And those were the kinds of paperbacks that were represented in this store. So, and it was a store that had full sections of poetry, philosophy, religion, history, science, mathematics. So books that were not just only appealing to a popular, mass audience, but I can only say serious literature. When he opened up the paperback store, which I believe was a year or two before 1966. So the paperback store on St. Catherine Street was a rather long, narrow store with an L off to the left as you entered, sort of in the middle of the store. So this was sort of partly what I mean by world class, is he had built a mezzanine. So there was a set of stairs that went up, and all around this L or T was an aisle with a railing, and then that whole upper part was covered in shelving. So my first job there, and this is where I learned the fundamentals about bookselling. So the difference between the hardcover, a paperback, a trade paperback, a mass market, learned about authors. So this would have been, let's say, this was 1966. As I say, these trade publishers were publishing, were becoming a more popular format. You went to the poetry section, which probably spanned, let's say, 8 feet wide, maybe 10 feet wide, by floor to ceiling. And it contained every poetry title in print, in paperback at that moment in time.
Wow.
I'm not talking about just, Wallace Stevens and E.J. Pratt and, Longfellow. It had literally every available poetry title in print at that time, right? And talk about a bookseller's education. Okay, Dan, I want you to shelve these books in poetry. And you start at A, right? And it was all there.
Because we're in Canada, we had access to British titles and American titles. So this included both?
Both, right. British, American, and Canadian, of what there was of Canadian at that time. And there wasn't much.
No.
But it would have included, City Lights publications, for example.
Right.
It would have included, small press stuff as well as, more traditional formats.
Well, Coach House set up in 65, so maybe you were just starting to get some of that.
Yeah, I don't think there were any there might have been some Coach House titles, probably not. When I started is really just at the beginning of that small press movement in Canada. We talked a bit about this before, as that was sort of part of this renaissance that was going on at that time. Gee, I've lost the thread of the question that you first asked me.
That's okay. You said that it really was an education because you had everything that you could get a hold of.
Correct. Yeah. So there were no gaps.
That's what made it such a great bookstore, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And that wasn't just true of poetry.
No.
Like I can't answer for history, but I mean, basically it was all there. And then between the other stores, you had the other titles in hardcover. You also sold a lot of remainders. He had a big sale every year. So the kind of the warehouse was on the second level of the block over on St. Catherine Street, the office and the warehouse, because they used to do weekly fill. So how you did your inventory is you had a list, long lists. You would go with a clipboard and go to like poetry or history, and you would take inventory, and there'd be collected poems of, and it'd be 0. And you'd fill in 0. Then that list would go to the warehouse. So that list had to be in by, say, Thursday. And then by the following Monday, you'd get, 30 boxes would be delivered, and you'd have to shelve those books.
Okay.
So that was called the fill list. You did the fill.
Right. And the warehouse was fairly close by?
At that point, the warehouse was literally across the street.
Okay. Yeah. And real estate was cheap in Montreal, I guess.
Real estate was cheap. And look, they weren't talking about hundreds of thousands of titles. I think they were talking about a more limited, it just the numbers were smaller. So that was my first job in the book business.
And so what was the number one takeaway from that?
I started, I think, in April and worked full-time through September. And then left to start back at school. I started to take night courses at what was then Loyola College in Montreal West. So those, call it 6 months, were really, for me, my takeaway was they trained me in the knowledge of being a bookseller, and not just the books, but also how to run a cash register, how to close up, how to, cash out. Look, obviously Louis trusted me, and I needed the work. Joy and I were young and had no money. Joy had got a job as a secretary in an accountant's office. Yeah. She made $55 a month, and I made a week, and I made $45 a week. So between us, we kind of had enough to pay the rent and enjoy Montreal. Like, we had no kids or responsibility. So he had a store at the airport at Dorval, and he needed people to work on the weekend. So I'd say, I need the extra work. So I'd work my full week. And then on the weekends, I'd go out to Dorval and run this little store by myself. There was no staff. You were the only person. I don't know, it was maybe a couple of 100 square feet. The store closed at 10 or 10:30 or 9 or 9:30. And you had to do your cash, take the money to the bank, because the last bus back to Montreal from Dorval was like at 11, right? Yeah. And if you missed that bus, you were done, right? You were sleeping at the airport. So all of those things, staffing, cash management, inventory, they kind of taught me the fundamentals, and also who the publishers were, what the names of the publishers were, where you got Anchor books. Anchor belonged to Doubleday, right? That sort of thing.
It gave you the lay of the land.
A crash course. It gave me a crash course. And look, Nigel, I was not the only one. Classics graduated dozens and dozens and dozens of people over those years who went into the book business and became prominent in the book business. Franz Donker, for example, worked there. Marty Cutler worked there. They're just to name a few.
What I'm trying to get at, though, is was there some kind of lesson that you learned?
Yeah, I'll tell you what the lesson was. Yeah. For me, the lesson was that there was a market for good books and good literature.
Okay. So,
If there was one takeaway,
yeah.
it was that you could sell your goal as a bookseller was to carry all of the poetry. That was your role, was to make all of that available to the public, from the very esoteric, high end, small publisher to the mass market. And if you had to drop anything, it was you kind of said, the mass market will be filled someplace else.
Yeah.
But I have a role to ensure that the best read and the most educated of my customers find what they're looking for in the store.
But you've got to make money too.
Right. So I kind of didn't really understand that, because I didn't know about the costs of setting up a store, or the costs of purchasing inventory, or what it would cost to have Mies van der Rohe design a store. So, but I'll get back to that. So I left in September, got serious. I think I enrolled in 2 courses at Loyola. Got a part-time job as an amanuensis to a writer.
Yeah.
Name is G.R. Stevens. It doesn't matter. He was a nonfiction writer. Interesting guy, but he lived in Montreal West. We lived in Montreal West, and he needed an amanuensis and someone to do indexing and help with some of the transcribing. So that sort of paid the rent. And then I went back to school and got married, decided to get more serious about going back to school, and started to apply to finish my degree. And that's how I ended up in Ottawa. So the book business was not necessarily part of my grand plan. My brother was teaching at Carleton, and we had some other family in Ottawa. And Carleton, I don't know whether I should be so proud of this, Carleton was one of the few universities that did not require a 2-year residency to complete a degree. So most universities said, you need to complete 10 courses or 2 years before we'll grant you a degree. Carleton, for some reason, said you could, we'll accept 8, you can do 8 courses or 6 courses. So that part of the attraction of Carleton was it accepted all of I had some credits from University of Manitoba. I had then these 6 credits from Loyola over the 2 years, and I didn't want to lose those. So I wanted those to be applied. So I was in a hurry to get a degree. So this was like 1968, we moved to Ottawa. And then Joy quickly became pregnant, not part of our 5-year plan. I won't be the first to admit. One of many 5-year plans that didn't quite pan out.
Did they have, they had birth control back then, didn't they?
They did? Now you tell me. Yes, they did. Let's leave it at that, Nigel.
Sure, okay.
Then I graduated and then enrolled in the MA. So my plan was to pursue an academic career.
I see. Like your brother.
You like my brother. He's in sociology. I would have done an English degree, right, in English. But I quickly realized that even with an MA, which I didn't complete, I would have been a long way away from making a living. So I started to look for a job. And I thought, gee, I'd like to be in the publishing business, or I'd like to be in the book business. That was 1970.
What attracted you?
Just because what else could I do with an English degree? Although I could have gotten a job. At that time, a university degree, you could have walked into any insurance company or any bank, any government. They would have given you a job sight unseen, basically. So I went to Classic. They had a big store in Ottawa that had opened, I believe, in 1967 in the National Arts Center, faced on Elgin Street, and you kind of went down a few steps. It was quite a large store, and next to it was an art store.
And they just built that, right? They had
just built that. That's right. And part of the plan was to have a world-class bookstore there, and then art gallery, poster store, framing shop, world-class store. So not as big as the one in Montreal, but in terms of design, in terms of selection.
Yeah.
The manager's name was a woman by the name of Sheila Barnum. I walked in and I said, look, I need a job. And she hired me more or less on the spot as the assistant manager.
Well, you'd already worked at Classics.
I'd already worked there. Right. So
Yeah.
so they knew who I was. So
Yeah.
I had that experience. And
Yeah.
it just so happened that they were looking for an assistant manager. So I worked there that summer and I was making $90 a week.
Okay.
But it wasn't enough to live on. And I wanted $100 a week. And I went to Sheila, and I didn't go directly to Louis or to Rose.
No.
I went to Sheila and I said, look, I need $100 a week. And Louis wouldn't give it to me. So they, for whatever reason, was, above my pay grade, or that's what they paid assistant managers. Look, and this is a completely self-serving anecdote, which I have no verification for, but I only learned years later. The anecdote was, don't let a Mozersky get away for $10 a week.
Right.
We lost him because we wouldn't pay him, and he would have been an asset.
That's the Mozersky rule.
Mozersky, right, exactly. Which did come up later in my career, but that's another story.
You said, fuck you, I'm setting up my own store.
No, I didn't do that, right? I just said, I was just disappointed. By sheer coincidence, the neighbor in the complex that we were living in, which was a row of townhouses off Saint Laurent Boulevard, was an Egyptian who was a principal of an English language government school. So on Carson Grove, there was a big campus that was in those days a booming, because there were all these, bilingualism. Trudeau was promoting bilingualism. They were training French civil servants to speak English and vice versa. And he was had just been hired and he was looking for teachers. And I just bumped into him one day outside and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm working in a bookstore, but I'm not very happy. And he said, what's your educational background? And I said, well, I have an honors BA in English and partial MA. And he said, how'd you like to become a language teacher? And I said, sure. Filled out an application form and they hired me. So this was September 1970. By the way, a great job. You worked 4 hours a day. You had 3-week classes, so your students rotated. Pay was about $8,500 or $8,000 a year, which was back then more money than I ever thought I would ever make. And it was great experience, right? And I learned about ESL, and there was a whole curriculum and training. And the French students were fantastic, is all I can say. Military, RCMP classes, civil servants from all over, mostly from Quebec, but from all over. And they were terrific. They were fun to teach, and it was a great experience. So I did that for about a year and a half, and I got passed up for a promotion.
Oh, dear.
And I wasn't happy, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't happy.
You're not a very good employee.
Oh, so, I was a terrible, obviously.
Yeah. Did you then say, fuck you, I'm setting up my own?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, right.
So now we're into 1972, summer 1972.
That was great money, though.
That was very good money. My total ambition in life was to make $10,000 a year. Like I said, if I made $10,000 a year for the rest of my life, I would be set. So that summer, I started to looked in fact very carefully at a store in Elmville Acres. Do you know that? Yeah, shopping center. They were, I think at that point, enclosing these malls as they were Billings Bridge, right? So they were enclosing those malls. I didn't have any money, but I had a relative was willing to lend me. In the end, it was about $15,000, but at that point, it was $12,000, and was quite enthusiastic. Kind of a surrogate father. My father had passed away a couple of years before, and he had a kind of paternal interest in me because he himself was interested in books and had a passion for books. Anyways, it began to look. I was still teaching, but began to look at locations. So there was a store at Billings Bridge. So Billings Bridge was then enclosing itself. The last store available was a 240 square foot store that had been leased to a perfume store. And I approached the management. I had nothing, right? I had no business, I had nothing. I walked in, I said, I want to open up a bookstore.
Well, you got some experience.
But this tells you a little bit about the times.
You
right?
do have experience, though, but yes.
Yeah, that's true. And I had a degree, and I was married. So I had, I wasn't just, that's true.
And you had $12,000 too.
So this was September of 1972. By November 28th, we were open. Wow, so literally in 3 months, I hired he wasn't an architect, he was a designer, and he designed this little jewel box of a store. Right. You can imagine 20 feet by 10 feet, the front all glass, and just in miniature. We had sections like classics. We had a poetry section, a philosophy section. We had a women's study section, like one shelf.
Way back then.
Women's section in the front. Fiction.
I guess feminism was in pretty high.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And just to show you how effective feminism was, I remember exactly. It was in the far left corner. We had an island, sort of a short island, and then the shelves all around. That bay included not just feminism, but also, let's say, sociology, anthropology, philosophy. The books on women's studies or feminism were on the bottom shelf.
Well, you put them there.
Well, that's the way they ended up.
Okay.
Like it wasn't deliberate. It just, maybe it was alphabetical. And don't think shortly after we opened, a woman walked in and said, I have to bend down to get books on feminism.
Right.
And you're
making me kneel.
You're making me kneel. And don't think the minute she left that store, I moved those books to the top shelf.
What's interesting, Dan, is just about a week ago, I interviewed Lenny Goodings, who's the chairman of Virago.
Right.
I think they got going maybe a year or two after, like
a little later. Yeah.
Did you start buying early on from Virago or not?
Honestly, I don't remember.
Okay.
Would have depended on who distributed them in Canada. It seems to me there were more like the Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, Gloria Steinem, those sort of more popular books. Don't forget, it was like a shelf. It was like a 2-foot shelf. Virago would have been later. I don't remember buying Virago books till they really began to reprint some of those, women authors. Yeah.
Tell me, how did it work for ordering books back then? Did you just have to deal with one distributor or what?
No, not at all. That was a problem in the industry. Look, I wasn't the only new bookstore that opened. This was a time of creative renaissance in Canadian and awareness of Canadian writers and Canadian literature and Canadian history. And there were small bookstores were opening, some not so small, by independents all across the country. Longhouse in was a few years ahead of us, but Longhouse in Toronto, and even
what about Leishman's? What about them?
Leishman's had been around. So the landscape at that time was very heavily entrenched in religious bookstores and department stores. Departments. book
And
departments.
stationary stores too.
Stationary stores,
Yeah.
and other than the chains. So that I'm sort of excluding the chains, which were then at that point kind of mass merchants in malls. But the rest of the kind of early 60s, mid 60s, late 60s, this landscape was church, religious bookstores, and the department store book departments. Industry was kind of skewed that way. So travelers, the book reps, now we call them the book reps, but in those days they were book travelers. So some of these were old timers who would take their books in trunks, put them on trains, come to Ottawa, take a room at the Chateau Laurier, and then have the buyer for Freeman's. So Freeman's was a big department store in Ottawa downtown. The renowned buyer was a woman by the name of Diane DeStonis.
Okay.
And they would woo and feed and drink her. I'm using a bad phraseology here. Invite her up for dinner, and then they'd present the lists, and then she would go back to the store. And
it's called old-fashioned selling.
Old-fashioned selling, exactly right. Throw in a few dirty jokes to the boys, the odd ethnic or anti-Semitic joke. I was a witness to a few of those. How did you get these books? You'd write to Bantam of Canada or Longmans or McClelland and Stewart, and you'd say, I had a little form letter. I'm Dan Mozersky. I'm opening up a bookstore in November. Please send me your lists. Please send me your credit application form and whatever other information I need. And please have your representative call on me at their next visit to Ottawa. So you'd get a phone call, and they say, oh, here's the credit application, fill it out. Usually you had to give 50% of your first order. And I would go through the Bantam catalog or the McClelland and Stewart catalog or Penguin catalog. Big part of your inventory was Penguin. And you place an order.
How many different catalogs did you get typically then?
So of the major publishers might be a dozen to 20. So don't forget there were the mass market houses who were not just mass merchandise. NAL's published classics, Dell classics, Penguin, Collins paperbacks, a big list, very important. So those alone, there were 6 or 8 of those. And then there was the Random House and the Doubledays and as I say, McClelland Stewart and all those other major publishers. There were quite a few. Oxford, big, all of the J.M. Dent, Smithers and Benelli. Like you've never heard of Smithers and Benelli, but they had books you wanted to buy, right? Like these were
not Leonard Smithers.
No.
He's turn of the century. He was a turn of the 20th century. Okay.
Yeah, no, but like General Publishing, Stoddart, his father was,
Cop
Clark, exactly.
Clark Irwin, was that another one?
Clark Irwin, yes, yeah. Yes, Clark Irwin was a big one. Made a lot of Canadian books, but they also Thomas Allen. Yeah. All of these guys, Prentice Hall, a huge trade publisher.
And Ryerson too.
McGraw-Hill Ryerson, exactly. I mean, Charlie Farquharson's, History of the World was a huge bestseller. I think that was published by Methuen. Methuen was published all of Tolkien.
Yeah.
You couldn't get the Ballantine Tolkiens. You had to get them from the British editions, Allen and Unwin. And Methuen was a very important supplier. So there were a lot of suppliers. So, you place the order, send in the credit application, send in your 50% or whatever they wanted. And more or less got the books in time to open. And in fact, we didn't open voluntarily. So we were stocking the store. And literally on November the 28th, the crowds were so big in the mall that the customers forced the doors open, and we
pretty good
to sell books.
Let's look at.
So, but I want to answer this question about the reps because I think it's important.
Yeah. Okay. I'll let you do that.
Okay. So the reps, they didn't understand all these little bookstores that were opening up. Didn't know who they were. They couldn't do this wooing and screwing and drinking that they used to do at the hotel. They'd have to actually come to the store. Within 2 or 3 years, there were about 65 or 70 new bookstores in Eastern Ontario.
That's my question, is why this boom? What explained that?
It's not an easy question, and I'm not sure I have an answer. So there are two things. You know this, maybe you don't. As you get a little older, you realize that once you were part of a zeitgeist, but now you may not any longer be part of a zeitgeist.
Dan, I bring my zeitgeist along with me.
Well, okay, so you don't have that problem. I lost my zeitgeist a long time ago. Okay. So there was this, this kind of baby boom demographic that was going on, not just here, but in other parts of the world. Young, dynamic, interested in new ideas. Trudeau had been elected as leader of the country in 1968. He was leading us down a more progressive, liberal path.
Well, there was also the Canada Council had set up in the late 50s, and they were funding publishers, but right. I don't think they were helping booksellers.
They weren't helping bookstores, and I don't think the impact of that had yet been felt. I think it had been felt in the other arts, like theater and ballet, and where they funded those kinds of endeavors, but I don't think they quite worked out, we need to support independent publishers by giving grants. There was no Ontario Arts Council, as far as I know, at that point that was funding just new ideas. Look, I said this to the other day to my wife. I said, talking about aging, I said, you remember when the slogan used to be, don't trust anyone over 30. That's what it was, right? We were getting rid of the old and bringing in the new. So I think that was just part of the general zeitgeist. Then this whole business of related to this was discovering our own history and our own heritage and our own literature. We didn't want to be seen only as a colony. We were deathly afraid of American imperialism and American culture. Even though we,
it seems to me that the economy must have been good enough to support what you guys were doing. I mean, the other stuff doesn't explain the fact that you'd be willing to take a risk and set up all these different bookstores.
It was a minimal risk, though. It was a small investment. I heard the interview with Pat McGarren. The truth about the book business is it's a very easy entry business. You ask Pat, well, what does iLab or eLab do, right? Like, what is well, fact is they don't do anything. Right?
The Association of Antiquarian Booksellers.
They do nothing, right? There's no training. There's no bookseller school. There are no courses. There's no lectures.
It's just you pay your money and you basically can say you've got a reputation because you belong.
Exactly. And until you screw somebody out of some serious money, you're a member of iLab or the local or the country. And the reason why I say this is because you'll see by my CV, my activities with the Canadian Booksellers Association, I was very involved in education. I thought it was very important to professionalize bookselling, right? Whether that was knowledge of finance or knowledge of numbers or knowledge of professional standards. It was very important to me because what you end up with is an industry of amateurs, and that's, to me, not good. But I do think the other thing that was going on was this discovery of our own heritage. So first year, that November, like from November 28th to December 24th, we basically made our sales on books from McClelland and Stewart. So without being specific, but there was, I believe, a Margaret Atwood, there was a Pierre Burton, one or other of the railway books, there was a Farley Mowat, there was a George Swinton on Eskimo art, there might have been the Peter Mellon book on the Group of Seven, and there were like 2 or 3 others. I remember phoning at McClelland and Stewart every 3 or 4 days
Right.
and saying, I need 50 copies of this, I need 100 copies of that, I need another 50 of this. And they would put them on the bus overnight. And the next day I would go to the bus depot and I would schlep those boxes. And that was the inventory that got us through Christmas. So there was this pent up demand for, I want to know what it is like to be a Canadian. I want to read these stories. I want to understand my culture.
Well, that's why Pierre Burton was such a huge hit, right?
And Farley Mowat, those two alone did.
Well, those two, yeah, they kept McClellan and Stewart afloat.
But they sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like Pierre Burton sold, 12,000 copies of a book.
No.
Literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just that. So that was that moment, you could say, where Jack McClellan, understood the zeitgeist. But the zeitgeist was coming this way, right? It was give me more, give me more, give me more.
Yeah. Sounds like a pretty good time to be a bookseller then.
It was a very good time. Exactly. And all these other little stores, so some lasted longer than others. Some didn't last very long at all. Some were in bad locations. So we started an organization. Again, you'll see on that CV, Bill Roberts and I of Leishman's. So it was a kind of an interesting situation. We were rivals and competitors, but we were friendly rivals and friendly competitors.
Yeah, I hear that a lot when I talk to people in the business.
Yeah, we shared a lot of information. We shared customers in Ottawa, certainly. Within a couple of years, we formed the Ottawa Regional Booksellers Association, Bill and I.
Right. What explains the fact that you were able to stay in business and expand? What explains that? The zeitgeist as well?
The zeitgeist, and we were successful financially, for one. So the stores never struggled in that sense. I always made a profit. I had a very good accountant who was a close friend of mine, who advised me. And he was one of those old style accountants who not only knew about sort of financial statements, but if you asked him, how do I ring in a refund on Tuesday that I got on, Thursday, he'd say, do it this way. In other words, he understood finance. He also understood operations, retail operations.
Okay.
So I guess that was instrumental. The fact that we had money, a good relationship with the bank, but we put our first house up as a security for a business loan, and ambition. I clearly have to say, both my wife and I, who worked in the business, my wife worked with me in the business.
Yeah.
By then we had 3 kids. By 1975, we had 3 young kids.
Wow.
And I was driven by need, right? Like I needed to make a living.
Yeah.
So it sort of, I'm having a little trouble here because I think I don't want to give myself more credit than is due. I think I was a pretty damn good bookseller.
So why is that?
I would not be the one
then?
to say that, but I think other people have said it. And I think I was smart and successful and knew how to buy. So I did all the buying.
Okay, so that's the key?
I would say that in those early years, that was the key. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what does that mean, Dan?
It means you kind of have your pulse on. So there's 2 sides to it. One is the industry. So very quickly through Bill Roberts got me involved in the understanding of the industry, which publishers were doing what kinds of books were being written by whom. And then the other part was what the public was demanding. So somewhere between those 2 was this ability to buy the right.
That's right, to mix supply with the demand, right?
Exactly.
But so how did you make yourself aware of the supply?
I gave a lot of time to publishers' representatives. When they came,
They weren't trying to give you booze and take you into bed then.
Absolutely not.
They
Absolutely.
got better.
Yeah. To begin with, they started to visit the account, right? Like that was the biggest step.
Right.
Is that, and again, the organizing the Ottawa Regional Booksellers was, we had two real issues. One was shipping, with huge number of problems with damaged books and shipping. And then the second issue of we couldn't get reps to come to the bloody stores. So
Right.
we organized a book fair. We said, don't come to the store, go to a hotel, we'll come to you. And we did that book fair for, I don't know, may still be going on for all I know, went on for about 20 years.
So you got all the reps to come to the to the hotel, and then you had meetings with each.
And then you made appointments, and you went from one to the other. You took your week or 3 days. They came in a week in the spring and a week in the fall or end of summer. And we sort of said, okay, you're not going to miss us because these 60 booksellers have registered. These 50 publishers have registered. Here's the list, and then so I'd spend, my 2 hours with Collins, and then I'd go to Firefly.
Perfect.
So there was a solution to a problem.
What about the shipping problem?
Shipping, the shipping kind of morphed. As it turns out, what we found out later was there was I don't remember, 10-foot drop for the parcel chute to a cement floor in the Ottawa post office.
Oh, Jesus.
So it was almost impossible that a box would not get damaged. Now, I don't remember whether we solved that problem, or I think we set up with shipping companies. It seems to me that we arranged with a company called Apex. I don't think they're still around. And we said, you see, don't forget, Toronto booksellers got free shipping.
Yeah, that's a big benefit. Yeah.
Big benefit, right? And this goes back to the days when Britnell's had a little kid on a bicycle. Someone would order a book, and the kid would go to Macmillan on Bond Street, pick up the book, and then deliver it to the customer. So within Toronto, there was no charge for shipping. So they were at an advantage. We were at a disadvantage. What we did was we arranged with, I'm pretty sure it was Apex, and we said, okay, we'll have all of our Toronto shipments consolidated in your warehouse. So that was free. Then Apex would deliver those to Ottawa, and we would pay what was a negotiated rate.
You got the free shipment in Toronto to the Apex, and then Apex delivered to you guys.
Right. And so that solved the damage problem, because Apex was a private trucker, and we still paid for shipping, but we didn't mind because at least we were sort of loophole in the system. So, those were the kinds of the things we did on a kind of cooperative basis. The expansion, like I don't know when it was that I realized if you could make X number of dollars in one store, you should be able to make X times 2 in a second store. So I don't know when that was.
Or even more than 2, because you've got
economies of scale. In terms of the development of the stores, so that we opened that 240 square foot store in Billingsbridge in November. 18 months later, we'd already moved to a bigger store in Billingsbridge. So we moved to a 1,200 square foot store, again, also kind of in the middle of the mall, but a rectangular store with a lot of windows. So within a year and a half, it was obvious that the small store was too small and that we needed a bigger store. So that was when I kind of learned the business of bookselling, right? The business was, bigger store, you need more staff. So instead of 1.5 people, now I needed 6 people. I needed an office, I needed storage, needed a bookkeeper, needed a shipper receiver, that kind of thing all happened when we moved to that store. And maybe it was there. And I wish I still had my original books, like accounting books, but we went from, I don't know, $120,000 a year to $1 million a year.
Okay.
Right. Like it was, or to 600,000, right? It was like, wow. And then it was sort of, whoa, well, you know what? Maybe you don't want 100 stores, but maybe you want 3 stores or 4 stores or 5 stores.
Right.
And then it became a matter of real estate. So once you had the formula down and you built, and again, to go back to the quality stores we talked about with Classic, I mean, I did learn all my stores were architecturally designed, wooden fixtures, first class fittings, well laid out, remainders here, hardcovers there, new books here, sort of well designed, special orders. We did a lot of special order business.
So the customer felt like, wow, this is a really lovely special place. I like being here. Is that it?
And also hired educated, dedicated people and treated them well. Now, the treating them well, you may have to ask them if you find one or two. They may have a different opinion.
Give them the $10
raise to assistant manager. You mean? I thought I paid.
Wait a sec. Did you follow the Mozersky rule?
I thought I paid fairly. Let's. I never believed, as some of my colleagues, that the minimum wage was the maximum wage.
Right.
I never believed that the minimum wage was the maximum. So then it became a matter of real estate and also a bit. So go back to this zeitgeist. So after we moved in Billings Bridge in 74, the next store we opened was the downtown store in Ottawa that's still open on Bank and Slater. That had been run by a couple, the Hessels. I don't know if you run into Dieter. So there was they first had a store. It was Inga. Inga was the wife and Dieter was the husband. Okay. And they first had a store on the mall, kind of with racks and paperbacks. Then they started to expand and open 2 or 3 stores in downtown Ottawa, and then ran into financial trouble. And one of the stores that they had was the store on Bank and Slater. And when they went bankrupt, that lease became available, and I negotiated that lease with the government. It was a government building, great lease. They were great to negotiate with, easy people to deal with. And so in 78, but again, to show the kind of respect between booksellers, is Leishman's was 3 blocks down. I called it Prospero Paperbacks, and almost exclusively carried paperbacks. They were a heavy hardcover store, right? In that sort of traditional British sort of style store, lots of hardcovers. And I thought, I'm not going to poke Bill in the eye. I'm sure he wasn't happy about it, but it wasn't like I'm going to open on your front door and take your business. Pardon?
You didn't go head to head with him.
I did not. I tried not to, but in the end we did, because we were sort of became the 2 largest independent stores in the city, and we did just because. So I don't know. That was, again, I sort of thought, gee, what a great location. Let's do the Louis Melzack classic paperback, fill it with paperbacks. And although we did have a hardcover table, it worked. Trade, but also mass market. So then, just to go again in the keeping with this zeitgeist, so this is now early 80s, so 78. So that store on Bank and Slater consisted of 1,000 square foot modules. So there were pillars. There was like 1,000 square feet pillars, another 1,000 square feet pillars, another 1,000 square feet, and there was that fish restaurant there for years and years.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Then there was a printer there for years. And as those businesses went out, I took over the next 1,000 square foot module. So originally it was a 2,000 square foot store that I opened. And then when the next module came open in 82, I opened up a computer bookstore.
Oh yeah.
So it was a store devoted to the most arcane, esoteric, computer language, very expensive books, and again, endless demand. Like you couldn't keep the stuff, you couldn't keep those $85 books in stock.
You're surrounded by government offices, right?
Exactly. So I saw that. So again, you ask me how, why, what was going on. I just saw that there was a demand in the Billingsbridge store and in the Bank and Slater store. And I thought, let's try it. If it doesn't work, we'll just put other books in there. And we became very successful. Very successful.
That's just carrying all the latest stuff on computers,
programming, COBOL, all those languages that are no longer in any currency, that they could not get enough of them. Could not. And Firefly in Toronto,
that's
owned by Lionel Koffler, who I knew quite well, still know. He was the distributor for Q Books, QUE, big computer line. So we used to have sidewalk sales, right? Twice a year you'd have a sidewalk sale. We would put out tables. And I remember one year I and I used to come into Toronto and go to publishers' warehouses and buy up remainders and stock that they were getting rid of, or stock that no one else had seen and they were getting rid of. And I bought, there must have been hundreds of boxes of Q books. I swear to God, you'd think it was like a feeding frenzy. They could not get enough of them.
Were you selling to government departments or individuals?
Some government departments, but largely individuals, mainly individuals. It's sort of interesting. Bill at Leishman's had a very large government business, both government and public library. And although I sold some, I could never break into that business. And again, I don't know whether it was, let him have it, that's his world, that's my world. I did sell. Sometimes we'd get orders from school boards, end of budget. I never could do it. I don't know what he did, whether he cataloged or whether he did something special or selected books in advance, but he had that market. And I could never really break into it. So these were primarily individuals.
Okay. And so you were successful to the point where what? You figured, okay, I can retire now. I'm going to sell.
No, I was opening stores. So then we opened a store at the Rideau Center in 1984.
Okay.
It's a whole story unto itself so don't forget, I was a independent competing with Classic, Smiths, and Kohl's.
Right.
Who had the reputation, who had stores in every mall in the country. And, who is this pipsqueak Mozersky to come in and say he should, when they were building the Rideau Center, we should give this guy a store. Anyways, as it turns out, the Rideau Center consists of two buildings. Rideau Center, which was owned at that time by Oxford, or one of the big, and they may still be. And there's a part on Rideau Street when you enter, not the first entrance, but the next entrance in. That's a separate building. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a walkway right over the third floor. Well, that happens to be a building owned at that time by SAN, which was a big electronic distribution company in Winnipeg, owned by the Cohn brothers, Albert and something Cohn. Now, I'm from Winnipeg. I have no connection, right? I have no connection. Okay. But I had been denied a store in the Rideau Center.
Okay.
By that landlord. And someone, again, it's funny, right? I think it was a casual conversation.
Yeah, that seems to be a bit of a theme here, Dan.
Well, I think it shows that I didn't have a plan.
Well, it's good luck is what it is.
Good luck and then good execution. Yeah. Good luck and then good execution. I never had a plan, but I said, this is going to be the major mall in downtown Ottawa. It'd be great to have a bookstore here. Then pursued it, locked out of that landlord, and someone casually said, that part of the center is owned by the Cohn brothers in Winnipeg. Maybe you should talk to them. I called them up and they rented me a 1,500 square foot store, which did very well.
It's the Winnipeg Mafia that you called in on there.
I guess so. But again, I had there wasn't like I didn't, no family connection. No one said,
I'm sure you said, I was born in Winnipeg.
Well, I probably did. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And then I paid Winnipeg geography, right? Yeah. Maybe. So by then we'd moved to a bigger store in Billingsbridge. From the
Okay.
1,200, we'd moved to a 2,400 square foot store.
Yeah.
And so we had the Billingsbridge, Rideau Center, Bank Street at 4,000 square feet, because I'd now taken over the next module and I was going to expand. And then we opened in Montreal. Now, Montreal was a bit of a mistake, and probably the world would have unfolded differently had I not opened there. But again, our publisher's rep said, we're desperate for a good English bookstore in downtown Montreal. And the mood was changing. It was the print shop that was contesting the notwithstanding about the language, and they were pretty sure that there was going to be more openness. Anyways, we opened gorgeous store at Placeville, the old Mount Royal Hotel, Cour Montreal. Gorgeous walnut showcases in the anyways. And we did okay there in the first year. Our projected budget was $1 million, and I did 850,000. So we were pretty much on budget. And then they did the notwithstanding clause, reversed the whole mood in Montreal about more English, and that was pretty much the kibosh. So my plan was to continue opening stores.
Yeah. Okay.
And at this time, landlords were now approaching me. So they wanted an alternative to those three chains. Maybe had Classic already been bought by Smith. Maybe those two had already amalgamated, and landlords were looking for alternatives. And there weren't many independent bookstores in the country who had 3 or 4 stores and were in malls, right? In fact, there were very few, because mall rent was expensive, and they steered away from that. So I'll kind of wind this up about the sort of the Prospero history.
Let's go to the end of Prospero. Then I'll close this down, and then if you've got the stamina, then we can start on
the Indigo. Okay.
and do that with what you did in once you left there with Spadina Books. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Sound good?
Yeah. So we're now kind of late 80s. Store in Montreal is open, and I'm 43, 44. Been at it 16 years.
That's pretty good.
Facing a couple of issues. A bit of burnout on my part. So I'd already put in place a couple of management staff other than in the stores. Jane Scott, who eventually bought Books Canada, became the paperback buyer. So anyways, I had already kind of put in place a couple of people to take over some of the management responsibilities.
Right.
But we were facing computerization. So we were not computerized. Our inventory system was a system of cards. So at that time, it was A, very expensive, and B, there weren't very many systems that would have done what I needed done, which is to have kind of real-time inventory in all 4 stores with a central database. Wordstock in Massachusetts could do it, and a couple of others, but there was a nut that would have cost us, let's say, $250,000, $200,000 to $250,000. So a bit of burnout, facing some serious sort of capital expenditures, and the stores were kind of in need of a bit of refurbishment. So new carpet here, capital expenditures. But what was really happening, so we're talking 88, 89, is 4 stores, sales always went up like this, okay? Every month, 10%,
That's a 45-degree angle for those who are listening.
Okay, all right, thank you. Always 12%, one store might be 8, one might be 10, but it was always an upward trajectory. And around 88, that changed. Something changed. Now, there was a big recession in 89, 90. So maybe this was a precursor. maybe I lost the zeitgeist. Maybe I wasn't buying as well as I was. Maybe the stores weren't being as managed as well as they were. And I was feeling a bit of a burnout. At that time, Bill Ardell was the president of Kohl's. Bill Ardell and I had worked on a committee and had met through industry stuff, kind of hit it off, liked each other.
That's key too.
Bill is a great guy, by the way. Great leadership skills, loved by everybody.
Still alive?
Yeah, Bill is still alive. I haven't seen Bill for a number of years, but he's very good friends with someone. He plays golf with someone who is a friend of mine in the building, as it turns out, coincidentally. So I always know what he's doing. Kohl's was owned by Southam at that time. Okay. And I think they'd given Bill a mandate to expand and grow that business. Right. And one day we were at a meeting and he called me over afterwards and he said, how'd you like to sell your business? I said, make me an offer. And a year later, took a year, he made me an offer and we sold the business to Kohl's in November of 1989.
How much did you sell it for?
I sold it for $1 million.
Back then, I guess that's worth what? $2 or $3 million now.
Probably 2 or 3 million. I mean, it was about the money, but it wasn't really about the money, in the sense that we didn't negotiate. I said, Bill, give me a number.
Well, it's also about your health too, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't like I said, no, I want 2 million, right? And then we negotiated. I said, write me a number.
No.
He wrote the number. I said, I'm happy with that. So both my wife and I, we had equal shares in the business. Yeah. We split that. We took advantage of a tax credit, and we worked for them for 3 months as management consultants, and then I left the business. In a sense, what I did was I bought my pension. So that was the way I kind of thought of it. I didn't walk away with enough money that I would never have to work. We walked away with enough money that I would never have to be beholden to anyone again. So to go back to your way back when I was a lousy employee in my 20s, I was probably even a worse employee in my 40s and 50s and 60s, and the only person I ever worked for was Heather Reisman at Indigo. And in a sense, even though I did work for other people, I always considered myself a management consultant, kind of independent. Someone once said to me, you want to make sure you always have enough fuck off money.
For sure.
In life, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't, then you're stuck.
Then you have to sell your soul.
Right. Yeah. By the way, you're the only person I've ever told the amount that we sold the business to. So.
I've got a scoop.
Yeah, some scoop. 30 years later, Mozersky admits. Headline. If only there was an industry that cared.
Okay, well, on the note of this scoop here, let's close this section of our conversation down, because you mentioned Heather Reisman, and I think that's where we'll pick up part 2 of our conversation. So before we leave, though, anything else on your experience as a bookseller in Ottawa and Montreal? Anything that strikes you about that period in your life and what you were doing and what made you successful?
Well, luck. We've talked about luck.
Yeah.
Opportunity. So maybe, they always say where luck, meets opportunity.
Yeah.
In terms of the leases. Drive. Clearly, I was driven. I worked like a son of a bitch. I mean,
but you must have loved it, though.
I guess so. But listen, running a business is stressful. Don't let anyone ever tell you that it isn't.
Well, how many employees did you have?
Oh, employees? In the end, we had 42 or 45. I can never remember.
That's stressful.
That's stressful. I always would joke with my wife that, my school of management was the school of 2x4. When you sit down at your desk in the morning, how hard is the hit by the first 2x4 going to be?
Right.
The back of your head, right?
Right.
Because often that's what you ended up doing, was solving one issue, one problem, someone leaving, someone giving notice, someone theft. You take your pick, right? Damaged inventory, all of those things. Customers complaining. I enjoyed it up to a point. It became quite stressful. When we sold, obviously I didn't involve the managers in that decision. After we sold them, when we told them, clearly they were shocked. And one or two of them came to me and said, if we had known that you were going to sell, we would have run the business for you. And I think they would have done a pretty damn good job, because some of them were Cracker Jacks. I didn't see that. I couldn't see it for some reason. But it was certainly, even if I had stepped back or taken a partial role, or then, eventually sold them the business, although who knows what have happened in the next, would the business have survived the superstore? I don't know. It's only 7 years later that the first superstore opens. Would we have survived? Maybe we would have opened our own superstore in Ottawa. That who knows? It was pretty stressful.
I'm looking forward to hearing about your book collection, because you're a collector. I saw that on your resume.
Yeah.
But you no doubt collected books about books, didn't you?
Yeah. So that was a big part of the collection.
Yeah, I really, because I'm doing that, and as I say, I'm now looking for. It was interesting. You mentioned all the sales catalogs, right? That all the travelers had, that they would give you. That's exactly what I'm after right now, and they're not easy to find because everyone threw them away.
Exactly. No one kept them.
In fact, I'm just going to have to call a bookseller in San Francisco. I just found some Faber sales catalogs from the 1960s.
Right.
So I'm gonna buy those, and I am gonna pick up a few from Carol.
Yeah. Well, whatever I had, he now has.
That's right.
I wouldn't have had a lot of them.
No.
You're right. They were throwaways.
Yeah.
There was never any reason to keep last year's Oxford catalog.
No, but some of them were lovely. They're really nicely designed, and because it's a nice compliment, I think, to having the publisher's histories, which is what I collect.
Right.
And the same thing for Bookseller, whatever they produced. I'm interested in that stuff as well, as a compliment to some of the books about the booksellers.
Yeah. You mean the antiquarian catalogs?
No, I mean antiquarian, but also whatever a book, like, for example, did you guys put out anything or not? Did you just use the publisher's catalogs, or did you ever do any?
No, we never put out our own catalog. The Canadian Booksellers Association used to put out, it was called Books for Everybody. So at Christmas time, and this was a fairly important tool actually in the trade. So publishers would submit books to the Books for Everybody committee.
Yeah.
I think it was CBA. It might have been one of the Publishers Association. I'm pretty sure it was CBA, and or a separate wing or separate division of CBA. M&S would submit their top 10 titles, fiction and nonfiction, and then the Books for Everybody would design a catalog. Fiction, history, art, children's books. The bookseller would buy these catalogs and give them away. You could buy 1,000 or 2,000 for $100. Like, it wasn't expensive. It was a service to the bookseller and obviously a service to the publisher. They did one in the fall. The fall was the big one because the publishers used it as a tool to get you to buy their books, right? So when they were making their presentation, they'd say, oh, by the way, this book is in Books for Everybody, right? And then you say, oh, well, Books for Everybody, I better buy 3 or I better buy 5, right? And then they latterly started one in the spring, which was not as successful as the fall one.
How many years did you do that for?
Oh, years, a lot of years. We're going back into the 70s, certainly through the 80s.
I'm going to try and get my hands on one of those.
Yeah, I used to have some. I don't think I have any left. I think they went somewhere years ago.
Okay.
And then what you do is you could either get them imprinted or you'd put your store stamp on them.
Sure.
So
sure.
we'd have our store stamp and we just put a stack by the door
Yeah.
come Christmas time, and people would pick them up and use them to make their selections. So other than that, we never put out our own unique Prospero catalog or anything like that. No.
Okay. Okay.
But Books for Everybody, if you
I'll Google that. Yeah.
Google that, and I'm sure U of T somewhere in their archives have copies of that. The archives of the associations, like the Association of Canadian Book Publishers, I know they had a library. Have you ever contacted them? Are they still around? No.
There must be there is an association. There must be. I don't know if they're connected to the one that was around back then, but yeah, I should do that.
Yeah, there are two associations. There was the Canadian Book Publishers, consisted only of Canadian owned, and then there was the ACP, Association of Canadian, ACPB, Association of Canadian Book Publishers. They contain both foreign owned and Canadian, but largely foreign owned publishers. Someone must have kept archives of that, that stuff, or even I don't know where the Canadian Booksellers Association archives, where they went.
Yeah.
Maybe they went to the garbage. I don't know.
Did your Prospero archive go to McMaster?
No, it except for a couple of personal files and some personal boxes, like maybe 2 or 3 boxes. Everything went with the sale. It went to Kohl's, like all my employee records, invoices, all of that. And then, I don't know, they kept them whatever the minimum, 7 years, and then they destroyed them. And when we moved from the house to here, I called, no one was really interested. The only nibble I got was I have store plans, right? Like I told you that my stores were architecturally designed. So I still have some 8 or 10 rolls of store plans, and the Ottawa archives, Ottawa City Archives, did express some interest. Said, but you'd have to bring them, and and they're still in a box in my locker, and I haven't. No. Although John Metcalf, John Metcalf, right?
I sure do. He's a great collector. He's a great collector.
Great collector. He when we sold, so early 90s, we were on the board for a short period of time of the Friends of the National Library.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Right. So I was on for longer. He was on for a short period of time. And I remember him saying to me, which I'd never, ever thought about. He said, "What did you do with your archives?" Well, I said, what do you mean? Who would want Booksellers archives? Which is what I said to him. Who would want? He said, "You would be surprised." By then it was too late.
I know that he bought some of Porcupine's Quill archive.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. Yeah. Oh, so he just mentioned, he put the bug in your ear, but he didn't buy anything then.
It was too late. Like it was all gone to Kohl's, other than as I say, the 2 or 3 boxes of, personal letters and stuff that I'd managed to. Once I sold, it was sort of like done.
Yeah. You wanted to.
I'm done, right?
Yeah.
So even to the point where it took me a long time to go into the stores, even though we still lived in Ottawa.
Yeah, I bet. Yes.
It was a bit of a gut wrench for me to walk into, the Bank and Slater store or Billings Bridge. I couldn't do it for a long time. It's funny how you kind of move on, but yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good place for us to I'm glad I asked you that, because I think it'd be good to get that bit about the archives in there.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Thank you, Dan Mozersky, for this part of your career. And we'll look forward to talking about your exciting adventure with Indigo Books in part 2 of our conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you.